joining us. Let me just introduce him in case you don't know him. Nate Klug is a pastor at Arlington Community Church in Kensington. He is a published poet, has had many prestigious artist residencies, and his third book is coming out this fall in 2020. It's called Guests and Hosts. Did I get that in the right order?
Hosts and Guests.
Hosts and Guests,
Yeah.
sorry. Hosts and Guests by Princeton University Press. And we'll be looking forward to celebrating that with a party in the gallery or not, as the case may be. But we will be celebrating it, and we look forward to that. And Nate has been on the board of the Center for the Arts and Religion for a little while now, and we've probably known each other, I think it's like 4 or 5 years at this point, Nate. So my name is Elizabeth Pena. I'm the director of the Center for the Arts and Religion and the Doug Adams Gallery, and I rely on Nate for all things poetry related. He's teaching courses and workshops for us and helps us with all events related to poetry. And I'm super grateful for that, Nate, and I'm really happy that you're here with us today. And I was just mentioning to Nate before we started that, I mean, I was just astonished by his selection of poems for us today. And they just really hit me. So with that, I'm just gonna hand it right over to Nate to help us with this discussion. Nate.
Perfect. Thanks, Elizabeth. It's so nice to see everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I had planned to do something obviously in person for Poetry Month, and I didn't really know what I was going to do, but then after everything that's happened, I figured I needed to pick poems for us to look at together that spoke in some way to some of the reality that we're facing now. And I wanted to pick a variety of poems. So the first two that we'll look at today are poems from mid-century, so the middle of the 20th century. And then we'll end with two more contemporary poems written in the last few years. I think you'll see all of them have some themes in common, and I think all of them really do speak to some of the feelings that we're probably all dealing with in this weird time. So I don't think I need to do much more of an introduction. What I love about poetry discussions is just the pleasure of putting some language out into the air. And even though we're all on Zoom, I think that this format allows us to do that. So what I'll probably do with each poem is I'll read it once, and then maybe I'll ask someone else who's with us today if they feel like reading it, and then we'll get into a little discussion for a few minutes or more like 10 minutes, and I'll have a few things to point out, and then I'm also curious to hear from all of you what is catching your attention about each of these poems. So did everybody have a chance to click on the link that shared the poems with you? If you don't have the poems, I think I'll try to share my screen now. I did this correctly before, yeah. So this should work. So hopefully you're all looking at my screen now, and as we go, I'll just scroll down so we can all follow along that way too. So you can either look at your paper if you printed them out, or just follow along on screen. So this first poem is really the poem that came into my mind almost immediately after we started dealing with the shelter-in-place instructions. And I'm not sure why, because this poet, Edwin Muir, is not a poet that I know super well. This is his probably most famous, most anthologized poem. And you'll see it's a really wonderful combination of this kind of gentle voice and then this sort of eerie apocalyptic subject matter. I think that's what makes this poem so successful. And like I said, it really just came into my mind, and I'd been sharing it with friends, and so I'm glad to share it with you guys today. So this is the longest poem, so we'll make it through this one first, and then this is about 2 pages, and the rest are much shorter. So this is The Horses, and was first published in 1952. The Horses. Barely a 12-month after the 7 days war that put the world to sleep, late in the evening, the strange horses came. By then we had made our covenant with silence, but in the first few days it was so still we listened to our breathing and were afraid. On the second day, the radios failed. We turned the knobs, no answer. On the third day, a warship passed us, headed north, dead bodies piled on the deck. On the sixth day, a plane plunged over us into the sea. Thereafter, nothing. The radios dumb. And still they stand in corners of our kitchens, and stand perhaps turned on in a million rooms all over the world. But now if they should speak, if on a sudden they should speak again, if on the stroke of noon a voice should speak, we would not listen. We would not let it bring that old bad world that swallowed its children quick at one great gulp. We would not have it again. Sometimes we think of the nations lying asleep, curled blindly in impenetrable sorrow, and then the thought confounds us with its strangeness. The tractors lie about our fields. At evening, they look like dank sea monsters crouched and waiting. We leave them where they are and let them rust. They'll molder away and be like other loam. We make our oxen drag our rusty plows, long laid aside. We have gone back far past our father's land. And then that evening, late in the summer, the strange horses came. We heard a distant tapping on the road, a deepening drumming. It stopped, went on again, and at the corner changed to hollow thunder. We saw the heads like a wild wave charging and were afraid. We had sold our horses in our father's time to buy new tractors. Now they were strange to us as fabulous steeds set on an ancient shield or illustrations in a book of knights. We did not dare go near them. Yet they waited, stubborn and shy, as if they had been sent by an old command to find our whereabouts and that long-lost archaic companionship. In the first moment, we never had a thought that they were creatures to be owned and used. Among them were some half a dozen colts, dropped in some wilderness of the broken world, yet new, as if they had come from their own Eden. Since then, they have pulled our plows and borne our loads, but that free servitude still can pierce our hearts. Our life is changed. Their coming, our beginning. So this is a poem that kind of divides itself into two sections, right? We have this first section that kind of puts us in some context, at least. You know, the date of the poem might suggest that this is a speaker who's concerned with the Second World War, maybe even anticipating some of the tensions of the Cold War. And so we can imagine those kind of real historical moments, but there's also these images that are maybe futuristic or a little science fiction-y. And then we get this kind of second part of the poem, which to me is the really most powerful piece of writing in this poem. And I wonder if someone else would just read for us this second part, kind of starting, and then that evening late in the summer. Could we just hear that in someone else's voice?
Well, I can if everybody's being shy.
Thank you, Susan. That'd be great.
Okay, you wanted it from and then that evening?
Yes, please.
Okay. And then that evening, late in the summer, the strange horses came. We heard a distant tapping on the road, a deepening drumming. It stopped, went on again, and at the corner changed to hollow thunder. We saw the heads like a wild wave charging and were afraid. We had sold our horses in our father's time to buy new tractors. Now they were strange to us, as fabulous steeds sent on an ancient shield or illustrations in a book of knights. We did not dare go near them, yet they waited, stubborn and shy, as if they'd been sent by an old command to find our whereabouts and that long-lost archaic companionship. In the first moment, we had never a thought that they were creatures to be owned and used. Among them were some half a dozen colts, dropped in some wilderness of the broken world, yet now as if they had come from their own Eden. Since then, they have pulled our plows and borne our loads, but that free servitude still can pierce our hearts. Our life is changed, their coming, our beginning.
Thanks, Susan. I always think poetry is so enhanced by just hearing it in different people's voices, because it brings out just some different edges and emphases from the poet's voice. So yeah, I'd love to just maybe talk about this poem for a little bit. Maybe this is the first time you've read it. Maybe you encountered it in a poetry anthology. I suppose I'm interested in the way that though it creates this sort of mythical situation, it also speaks, I think, very directly to us right now. I mean, that's the amazing thing about poetry and literature in general, is that it's written out of some feeling, but then it encounters these feelings and people in the future that it would never have imagined. And I'd be curious for you all to hear, which lines or which moments here are resonating as you think about what you're going through in your days. Yeah, Elizabeth.
I would say for me, when I read this, I think it was the first part of it, when it talks about the first days and the second day and the third day, and the radio is dumb and we're waiting, and that really rang true to me. That feeling of sort of suspended animation that we have, I think, now. What day is it, and is time passing, or and then that notion of the old bad world that swallowed its children quick. We would not have it again, and speaking to what the future might hold, or how we can shape that future in a better way instead of going back to normal. But so that right away grabbed me. And then the second part of the poem that Susan also just read just kind of reaffirmed that by going back to the horses, away from the tractors, and kind of developing a new relationship from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really great. I like the way at the beginning, the speaker's able to count, the first day, second day, sixth day. And I think, as I think back to my memory of the way we were first reacting to this news, right, of shelter in place, and we could keep track in those days, and now it's like whatever day it is, we've passed into that kind of next stage, and here Edwin Muir figures it as thereafter nothing. The radio's dumb. And so one difference, right, between our situation where we're sheltering in place, but we have all this ability to communicate and watch the news and be on Twitter, in this situation of the poem, there's this lack of communication. This radio standing dumb. And then the speaker says, but now if they should speak, right, if there was some return, right, to society, which allowed news programs to come on again, if on the stroke of noon a voice should speak, we would not listen. We would not let it bring that old bad world that swallowed its children quick. We would not have it again. So this impulse, not to listen, but really not to even try to communicate. That's maybe how far the violence, the estrangement of the situation has gone, right? And if the poem ended there, it would be a really different kind of poem. I think in the first section, it's weird because there's not this anger from the speaker necessarily, or anger isn't the primary tone. It's sort of, I don't know, it's almost like a resignation or something. And then there's this, there's almost this kind of epiphany, this radical change that happens in the section that Susan read. I'm curious if folks had any lines or what did people make of this second section? This moment where suddenly they see the horses.
If I may.
Yeah.
I was struck by the some half a dozen colts dropped in some wilderness of the broken world, yet knew as if they had come from their own Eden. Since then, they have pulled our plows and borne our loads, and that I'm reluctant to project, and do the very 21st century, like this is the new bad world that replaced the old bad world. But I don't know if that's what the poet intended, but I sort of get that the social reproduction, even after the trauma of a war and this huge technological rearrangement, it one way or another the machine moves, whether the parts are metal or flesh, sort of thing.
You're particularly talking about that line. Since then, they have pulled, like horses have gone back
Yes.
to doing that work.
And in particular, the colts that, it's like, depending, not necessarily grammatically, but spatially in the poem, it is these fresh things from Eden that are just, whoops, welcome to the machine.
Totally. And I think that's maybe one way that Muir kind of complicates this vision. I think some people who are critical of lyric poetry say that, too many poets just get by, wandering around in their local park and then having some sort of epiphany with nature, right? And you could almost say that this poem falls into that format, but I think, like you're pointing to, that moment complicates it a little bit, doesn't it? It complicates the kind of renewal that is imagined, I think, where, and it's almost meant, it's almost like an aside, that actually they have gone back to doing this work for human beings. But that free servitude still can pierce our hearts. And then I think the last line is the line for which this poem is maybe justly famous. Our life is changed, their coming, our beginning. So there is a sort of renewal that's imagined there, and not fully realized, right? That it's this possibility of change that hasn't, it's inchoate, it hasn't really come into form yet, and maybe that's some of the power that resides within it, which I think certainly speaks to where we are now. As you think about people talking about, well, these big ways that we need to change, but where do we put our finger on it? Maybe we'll move on now. I'm realizing I can't see everybody on the screen at once. So if you're raising your hand and I haven't gotten to you, I apologize. But do just speak up and interrupt me if you have some burning insight to share. So Edwin Muir was a Scottish poet, and we'll move on now to our second poem, written by an English poet. So these first two are both written in the similar time period by poets in England and Scotland. And this is a poem by Wh Auden. And if you've read any of Auden's work, you know that he loves to use rhyme. He loves to use meter, real master of form. Muir's poem, just to speak technically, was sort of, it really relied on a sort of iambic pentameter, or that sort of, that da-da-da-da-da-da, that's close to the way that we talk sometimes. And Auden here is working in a slightly more dense kind of form. And so you'll hear that more song-like, I would say. And this is a poem that's called The Fall of Rome. And again, so he's writing it right after World War II. Auden was someone who grew up in England, but lived in the States for a long period of his life. So he knew both sort of past and present empires. And the thing I love about this poem is the way he's describing this past reality, right? The fall of the Roman Empire, but he's bringing in all these details that were very contemporary to his life. So as I read, just look out for those and think about what they remind you of, maybe in our world right now. The Fall of Rome. Oh, and I'll also say the second stanza, there's a phrase, agents of the fisc. And so the fisc was like sort of like the treasury for Rome, so they were people who were, bothering the folks who didn't pay their taxes. The Fall of Rome. The piers are pummeled by the waves. In a lonely field, the rain lashes an abandoned train. Outlaws fill the mountain caves. Fantastic grow the evening gowns. Agents of the fisc pursue absconding tax defaulters through the sewers of provincial towns. Private rites of magic send the temple prostitutes to sleep. All the literati keep an imaginary friend. Cerebratonic Cato may extol the ancient disciplines, but the muscle-bound Marines mutiny for food and pay. Caesar's double bed is warm as an unimportant clerk writes, "I do not like my work," on a pink official form. Unendowed with wealth or pity, little birds with scarlet legs, sitting on their speckled eggs, eye each flu-infected city. Altogether elsewhere, vast herds of reindeer move across miles and miles of golden moss, silently and very fast. Is anybody up for reading this one, just so we could hear it in a different voice?
I can read it.
That'd be great, whoever said that. Thank you.
Okay. The Fall of Rome. The piers are pummeled by the waves. In a lonely field the rain lashes an abandoned train. Outlaws fill the mountain caves. Fantastic grow the evening gowns. Agents of the fisc pursue absconding tax defaulters through the sewers of provincial towns. Private rites of magic send the temple prostitutes to sleep. All the literati keep an imaginary friend. Cerebrotonic Cato may extol the ancient disciplines, but the muscle-bound Marines mutiny from food and pay. Caesar's double bed is warm, as an uninterrupted clerk writes, "I do not like my work," on a pink official form. Unendowed with wealth or pity, little birds with scarlet legs, sitting on their speckled eggs, eye each flu-infected city. Altogether elsewhere vast, herds of reindeer move across miles and miles of golden moss, silently and very fast.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so it's interesting to think about this one side by side with the Edwin Muir poem, I think. Both of them move towards the animal life, right, at the end. These last two stanzas, we get the little birds, and then we get, I think in this very beautiful last stanza, the herds of reindeer. But whereas Muir's poem is maybe moves a little bit more slowly, right, more kind of deliberately. You know, Auden is really, each of these stanzas is like a little scene from a movie almost. You know, he gives you enough to imagine a deeper story, right? Agents of the fisc pursue absconding tax defaulters through the sewers of provincial towns. Just kind of imagining that happening. Caesar's double bed is warm as an unimportant clerk writes, "I do not like my work," on a pink official form. And he's interested in the contrasts, right? That are very especially prevalent in the end of an empire. So, you know, where the emperor's double bed is warm, and an unimportant clerk is writing out this complaint that may never be heard, and where cerebratonic, you did a good job with that word. I looked that one up, and I think it just means so cerebral that you're like super isolated. Does anybody have anything to add? I think that's what he's going for. So Cato, right? This writer may extol the ancient disciplines, but the muscle-bound Marines mutiny for food and pay. So again, interested in drawing attention, you know, maybe between these kinds of life at certain extremes of this society that maybe no longer finds a harmony or a resolution. It's interesting, I think, the way this poem starts in a more natural setting, a more sort of descriptive setting in the first stanza, then takes us through different elements of the social, and then kind of moves its lens back towards the natural world, such as it is. What did people make of the second to last stanza? Unendowed with wealth or pity, little birds with scarlet legs sitting on their speckled eggs, eye each flu-infected city.
My first thought was they are outside of the system and therefore safe and able to continue their way of life. They still get eggs because they are outside the city looking in.
Auden's tone is so, there's so much kind of, I think it's a form of irony almost. There's so much kind of archness and authority in the way he builds his lines. It's hard to tell where his own sympathies lie. So it's interesting, you know, a phrase like unendowed with wealth or pity, little birds on scarlet legs. You know, we wonder, is the speaker sympathizing with these birds for being so unlike us, for being so different from sort of silly and suffering humanity? And then we get this even further shift towards another almost realm altogether in this last stanza. Altogether elsewhere, vast herds of reindeer move across miles and miles of golden moss, silently and very fast. It's interesting to think about those lines as being descriptive of some sort of disaster, right? It's not necessarily, if you isolated that stanza alone, you might just think, oh, that's, that's a moving description of some sort of migration, right? But with everything that comes before, that sort of weighting it down, it has these other resonances, doesn't it?
I was really struck by both of those stanzas, like applying them in our own times, like the line, like unendowed with wealth or pity. I just was thinking through, like, this kind of debate about, like, do we sacrifice the economy or do we sacrifice people's lives? Like, do we value the wealth or do we have pity for people? Like, that's kind of what's obsessing people right now. And that there's this whole other world that's just like kind of looking on at it and not understanding at all or even really caring. And then something about the last stanza, like it kind of reminded me of like climate change, or this idea of like they're fleeing from something, and how for all we know there's been like pandemics of birds dying over and over and over that we don't we don't notice or care about, and they don't notice or care about ours. But then also there is this way of we're tied, that these reindeer are fleeing something, and there is something also like killing us, like, so both a sense of separateness and then also connection.
That's really great. Yeah. How did other folks take that last stanza? Was it, just to pick up on what you said, was it emphasize, for you, did it emphasize our connection, in this kind of web of life, or did it emphasize the sort of degree to which we've maybe cut ourselves off from these other forms of life?
I couldn't help but think about all these pictures we're seeing lately of nature taking over, now that we're all isolated in our homes. And so I guess I would answer that to say separation was what came to mind to me. But I love this thing that Brianna just said, which I never had thought about, was the sort of different species going around having their own pandemics and not really paying attention to, being affected by the other, and yet having this kind of connection. But I thought this was, really powerful and also hit home.
Yeah, those pictures of like, was it coyotes roaming the streets of San Francisco? Yeah.
Nate, I'm really struck by how silent these herds are at the end, because what could be more human than being a poet and writing an Auden poem that is so tightly cinched together with rhymes and rhythm, and here are these herds of reindeer that move away from. There's something alien about it. It's very optic. It's not tied to language. They're silently and very fast.
Yeah, and to me that gets back to the first part of the poem a little bit, where the speaker says, well, if the radios were to turn on, we would not want to listen to them. Mm-hmm. And the kind of the power in this silence of the reindeer.
It seems clever with the title Fall of Rome. I thought of, sort of classic takes on the barbarians of the north, the hordes of the Germanic Teutonic tribes. And here Auden displaces that reference to it's the north, but it's the animals in the north. It's reindeer in Scandinavia, Russia.
Mm. Just on a really microscopic level, I just love the way that word vast just kind of hangs out there. I mean, this is what poets really love and admire, is the, you know, the way that you don't know what that's going to refer to, right? Vast, you know, could be continents, and then no, it's these herds of reindeer, and then they're moving across, and then, well, you don't know what they're moving across, and so the way the sentence stretches across those lines and makes you kind of pause, almost like the way a film camera will reveal things kind of in sequence, to create some suspense. Okay, let's keep going then. Let's move more into the realm of contemporary poetry. This next one is by a woman named Tracy K Smith, who is currently the poet laureate, and she runs this really nice podcast, which I recommend, called The Slowdown. Probably some of you know it, but I think it's also replayed on one of the public radio stations. But she just reads a poem a day and talks about it for it's maybe like 10 minutes long each day. So it's one neat thing she's done as poet laureate. I always think poets must wonder like what they're supposed to do once they get that job. She's doing something useful. So this poem is from her last book, which was called Wade in the Water. And I think it was either the first or the last poem in the book. So it's sort of one of those kind of bookend kind of poems. And I chose it because I thought it would certainly go in conversation with the Muir poem especially, but also the Auden poem, in the sense that all three of these sort of take they make use of allegory, right? And the way you can kind of be making up this story, and you have this freedom for it to be true in some ways and not to be true in other ways, and then the reader gets to connect it and attach it to their own situations as they will. So yeah, this is called An Old Story, and I'll read it. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind. Livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream. The worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. Would any one of you be interested in reading this one?
I could do that.
Great.
An old story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind. Livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream. The worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke, and then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals long believed gone crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. So one thing I admire about this poem is actually something that I think it's a risk that it takes, because often as poets we're told to be as particular as possible, right? Like Ezra Pound says, go in fear of abstraction, you know, be as specific as possible all the time. But one thing she's making use of with the title, with this sort of allegorical frame, I think, you know, an old story. Well, there are lots of old stories, right? There's stories from lots of different religious traditions. There's stories from mythological sources. And I think she's making use of that in this poem to sort of suggest that the renewal that's imagined in the second half is something that, you know, humanity is going to be dealing with over and over again. I just read this article in the Atlantic by a historian named David Blight that was about Frederick Douglass during the Civil War, and how Douglass would give these long speeches that were basically sermons, and he would just talk about the book of Genesis. You know, he would talk about the way that, particularly the flood, right? The way that there was this enormous flood that wipes out everything, and then human beings have to start over again. And the way that that text can be useful, right, to a particular people millennia later was what really struck the historian in this article. And I think there's something similar going on here with the way that, you know, these first stanzas, it's so general, isn't it? You could read it in the context of fears about nuclear war, in the same way that Edwin Muir's poem could be read. You could read it with regards to slavery, I think. Tracy K Smith's African American. She often writes about the history of African Americans in this country. And so, yeah, I'm curious, how do people take these first two stanzas in particular? We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate swollen to a kind of epic wind. Is anything that stood out there or in the next stanza? And did it evoke a particular situation for anyone?
It certainly sounded like post-Trump America. I mean, that's, I think, part of what was in her mind.
Can you say that one more time, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like it describes the kind of social realities that we are experiencing in terms of inflated rhetoric, demagoguery, that is, talk about rageful dreams, having to a land that's ravaged. There's stuff here having to do with climate change and mass migrations, and just there's a lot of upheaval in the world that she's talking about in a sort of universal, almost at the existential level. It's not like it's one thing, it's everything. It's all of it at the same time.
Yeah, that's great. And I too hear in that third line, every hate swollen to a kind of epic when there's almost this comment on, I mean, you can certainly hear that. You can certainly read that as a reflection on sort of the use of language, right, in the Trump era, and the way that, you know, fascist, anti-immigrant dialogue, just the way things are so inflated, you know, from all capital letter tweets, right? Everything's sort of heightened and swollen. So I think it's interesting to read that line with regards to language. The other thing I'm interested in this, in these first stanzas, is just that little frame she gives it. We were made to understand it would be terrible, right? So that's slightly different than like looking back on something and saying, oh, it was terrible, right? It reflects on I think it reflects on the previous descriptions, right? The previous literature about apocalypse and disaster and renewal. that that have influenced the speaker, whether that's a religious upbringing, whether it's, reading the Iliad. So it's sort of meta in that way, which I think is interesting. And then,
if I can I just add one thing?
Yeah, please.
I mean, the word epic seems to be key, the kind of the extremes, the intensity. At first, I don't read that, but like it's epic. Like when you mentioned the Iliad, I think, I mean, the extreme language here, not just some hate, every hate, swollen, the epic wind, right? It's not just going to be bad, it's terrible. Every small one. I mean, and then even in the second one, the worst in us, broken, utterly down. I mean, it's extreme, and yet it's almost subdued extreme in a way. The way it flows, the words themselves are extreme, but it flows, so it kind of covers up the extreme nature of it in a way.
Totally. And that's something that some people have remarked about that Muir poem too, is it's describing stuff that's so horrible, but there's this, almost this gentleness, and Smith is also using this generally sort of, we were made to understand it would be, a line that's 4 or 5 beats, so close to the tradition of blank verse.
Nate, could I say something about those lines too?
Sure.
Real quick. Since the Trump era we're living in, I've often seen quoted the William Butler Yeats poem, The Second Coming, left and right. And it's hard for me not to have the lines about the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And here she's using that phrase, the worst in us have taken over and broken the rest utterly down. It reminds me of those lines in Yeats in his Second Coming, which is a similar sort of collapse of discourse and civic norms, apocalyptic.
Not being able to hold.
Yeah.
And so maybe that calmness that was just reflected on in the tone is sort of distancing from that intensity, right? That is possessed by the worst, right?
There's also, like, may I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Because the first line, I took it to sort of cast doubt on the whole poem, especially in conjunction with the title. Like, I cannot tell whether terrible things are supposed to have actually happened at the end of this. And I assume I'm supposed to be left in that sort of uncertainty. Like, was the hate a thing that was going on, or was that always just a story?
Totally. And yeah, this whole, the first 2 stanzas you could just read as sort of in the conditional tensor, so almost this thing that we're not sure, but then almost the grammar switches right when we get to a long age past. So maybe we can look at that now, and it'll be, I don't know if we hear this in the same tone, or if this is more acknowledging that there really was some stuff that went down, right? That we've passed through. A long age past, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. I'm struck by that phrase, when at last we knew how little would survive us. Whether that's the creations of great artists or capitalism. It's almost like this required, right, to let go of a lot before this new thing, which is something large and old, awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather than animals long believed gone. So again, animals at the end of the poem here. Animals long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. And then I think this last line is just beautiful. we wept to be reminded of such color. I think this, to me, this is a poem that gives me hope, right? When I think about that kind of vision, and it's still so general. She's really working in generalities, but it does articulate a sort of vision for something new that is to come after the storm.
But it does require something to die. That's the thing. I mean, it does require grieving expectations that have not come to be fulfilled, and knowing that those were not particularly well-placed hopes and dreams, and also coming to terms with what you've destroyed, coming to terms with what you've brought down around you, and then getting out of the way. I mean, it reminds me a little bit, like with the animals coming back. It sounds a lot like what you were talking about earlier with so much wildlife coming back to places that have been driven away by human encroachment, but now with people sheltering in place, there's a lot more life where there hasn't been necessarily. Being able to see the Himalayas from India, for example, in certain places that you haven't for decades, and so on. And that's, I've had that experience of feeling similarly to being wept, to be reminded of such color with when you can notice these phenomena that we've occluded because of the way we live, right? And there's COVID is sort of making us aware of that in new ways, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Any other last thoughts on these last stanzas? I love the off rhyme of one another and color at the end. I think that's, you can read a lot of that, almost contains like a whole politics in it. And the fact that it's an off rhyme, right? It's not exact, but it fits. Okay, should we move on to our last poem here? So this again is a recent poem, and this is one that I talked through with my congregation a few weeks ago, and we had a really interesting discussion. Somebody reminded me that processional is, among other things, it's a word for the last hymn in a church service. So if there's a processional, you're usually walking out, so you're walking out of the place of worship. So that's one kind of meaning that's contained in the title.
Nate, you're actually coming in with a processional. You're going out to a recessional.
Oh, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. So you're coming in. Okay, so that's important to clarify. You're processing in. So this is by Joanna Klug, who's a poet who's lived and taught all over. I think she lived in Montana when she wrote this. Processional. If there is a world, let me be in it. Let fires arise and pass. The sky fill with evening air, then sink across the woodlots and porches, the streams thinning to creeks. In winter, there will be creatures half locked in ice, storms blown through iron grates, a drug of whitest ardor. Let the old hopes be made new. Let stacks of clouds blacken if they have to, but never let the people in this town go hungry. Never let them fear cold. If there is a world, let it not be temporary like these vague stars. Let us die when we must, and spinelessness not overtake us, and privation. Let rain bead across tangled lavender plants. If there is a world where we feel very little, let it not be our world. Let worth be worth and energy action. Let blood fly up to the surface skin. If you are fierce, if you are cynical, half-hearted, pained, I would sit with you a while or walk next to you. And when we take leave of each other after so many years, the oaks will toss their branches in wheels of wind above us, as if it had mattered, all of it, every second, if there is a world. Does somebody else maybe who we haven't heard from feel like reading this one? What do you think, Eleanor? Do you want to read this?
Get my mute off. If there is a world, let me be in it. Let fires arise and pass, the sky fill with evening air, then sink across the woodlots and porches, the streams thinning to creeks. In winter there will be creatures half locked in ice, storms blown through iron gates, a drug of whitest ardor. Let the old hopes be made new. Let stacks of clouds blacken if they have to, but never let the people in this town go hungry. Never let them fear cold. If there is a world, let it not be temporary like these vague stars. Let us die when we must, and spinelessness not overtake us, and privation. Let rain beat across tangled lavender plants. If there is a world where we feel very little, let it not be our world. Let worth be worth and energy action. Let blood fly up to the surface skin. If you are fierce, if you are cynical, half-hearted, pained, I would sit with you a while or walk next to you. And when we take leave of each other after so many years, the oaks will toss their branches in wheels of wind above us as if it had mattered, all of it, every second, if there is a world.
That was great. Thanks so much, Eleanor. So I'm struck, somebody pointed out the way in which Tracy K Smith's poem, starts with this sort of conditional situation. We were made to understand it would be terrible, right? And the power that you get from this, imagining this, but never quite committing to its reality or non-reality. And this poem sort of uses a similar technique, and I think even embraces it more fully, right? With this use of the conditional throughout. If there is a world, let me be in it. Let fires arise and pass, and the power of that that conditional maybe lets the poet say some things that she wouldn't say otherwise. If there was a world where we feel very little, let it not be our world. Let worth be worth and energy action. I think one challenge in writing poetry that wants to be social, and which all poetry wants to be social. But one challenge in writing poetry that I think does apply directly to social situations is it's very easy to sound, I'd say, either sentimental or like you have an agenda, right? And maybe once you start doing that, then you're not writing poetry. And the way Joanna Klink uses this almost this refrain of the conditional to get to these beautiful statements, right? About human connection. I hear a lot of like Walt Whitman in this poem. I would sit with you a while or walk next to you. Were there any places in the poem that people particularly liked, or phrases that stuck out to people?
One thing that stuck out to me, let it not be temporary, like these vague stars. Because I don't think of stars as temporary, and it's like, if there is a world, let it not be temporary, like these vague. Is it saying that the stars are temporary? Or that the world is potentially temporary?
Yeah, it does seem to associate the stars with, maybe in their vagueness, with being temporary. I don't know. That's a good, yeah.
I thought
Maybe
that was because they're like blinking or something. They're distant and they're not very clear.
Yeah, the way from which, from our vantage point, we often can't see the stars, right? Even though they're there.
And they burn out. And also we sometimes are seeing stars that are no longer there, because the light takes so long to reach us. They're gone by the time it reaches us.
Yeah, that's a nice reading too. Yeah. It's surprising though, isn't it, to hear stars characterized in that way. And then we get "let us die when we must," right? So it's it maybe does make us think of the way the death of stars takes a little while to reach us here on Earth. Yeah. I'm curious about the title now that I introduced it and made us think about it. Processional, coming in, right, versus recessional, going out. How does that word kind of guide us through this poem?
I think it fits with the conditional voice. And from the very first sentence, let me be in it. It just, you're walking into it, let this happen and let that happen.
Yeah. It's funny. I was thinking of it as, okay, you're heading out into something. So now you're gonna keep these words with you. But it's not that. It's the beginning of something. Which in some ways it separates this poem, I think, from the other ones, which all of which, from the Muir to the Auden to the Tracy K Smith, they all kind of have this baggage, right? This backstory. Though I think Klink's poem does too. It's certainly not envisioning a perfect unfallen world. I think it's do her descriptions evoke the world that you recognize?
It reminds me a lot of Mary Oliver's poetry. And just kind of like this hope in like the natural process, but that you can live really deeply through that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of, you know, the first time you read this poem, it can feel, I think it's associative, so it's bringing these different phrases in. But you can almost read it as a sort of, sorry, there's a lot of dogs outside my window right now. You get winter. I was going to say you can almost read it as a sort of almanac, because you get winter, then you get plants a little bit later. You get oaks tossing their branches. So these details seem chosen to sort of maybe suggest a calendar in some ways. And let's just lastly just consider this. Let's consider sort of the point of this conditional, because you know, in one way, this poem is so positive, and it's talking in terms of embracing and community and walking with someone, but you know, the whole frame is actually also suggesting that there is not a world, right? That there is not such a place. And I'm wondering if that resonates with people, especially in this time. And I'm wondering, you know, especially the way Klug really, you know, she repeats it at the end as if it had mattered, all of it, every second, if there is a world. You know, it's almost like through all the descriptions, she's convinced us, and then she's like, if there is a world, and to remind us of the conditionality of this whole premise.
Yeah, I think her poem is sort of more destabilizing in some ways than the others, because the others kind of tell the story about, of kind of downfall, but then here's what happens at the end. You know, the reindeer are going across the fields or whatever. We can kind of see another vision, I guess, of the future in some way. And she just throws you back and forth, you know, in one sentence. So you kind of are wrestling with the issue of before and after all in one moment in the poem.
Yeah, I think I just chose this one because it does speak to a feeling I've been having when you think of how much you know, needs to change and how much is going to change, both in scary ways and necessary ways. It doesn't necessarily go what am I trying to say? It's not being too dramatic to say that the very sense of world, right, at this point is sort of thrown into question. And so I think that's one thing this poem explores. Any last thoughts about this one? I'm curious to hear which poem people really responded to. Any favorites from the four?
I love the last one.
Processional.
Yeah.
Yeah. Had people read The Horses by Edwin Muir? Is that one that people had seen before?
I hadn't seen it before, but it really hit me.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
I think that's about all I have to say. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciated your comments, and it's fun to think these poems through with you all. And hope we can do it again sometime.
Nate, thank you so much for leading us through that. It was a wonderful hour and a half, whatever it was, and enlightening. And it's always wonderful to have you lead us through this, so we can kind of get more insights and to hear other people's views. It's because it's always there's so much in the interpretation that we gain from it. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to Nate.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks so much, guys.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Stay well.
Bye.